This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 670, October the 8th, 1984. Now that I've gone through that essay with you, that article on the link of Jerry Falwell to Ronald Reagan and the fundamentalist belief of both of those men, because it is really hard to believe that they think similarly, but there is a lot of information or evidence that they do. And this talk about the rapture, the pre-tribulation and tribulation millennium. If you turn your Christian radio stations on, which I've been doing lately to pick up the lingo, it's on all the time, and references to Helen Marie Taylor distributing Bibles for his literature for the schools, wanting to get Bibles for the schools. And if you listen to those broadcasts, you begin to hear their thinking, and you realize that these stations are growing, and they're on 24 hours, and they mean what they're saying, and they have a lot of audience that call in and follow them in a very conscientious way. So now we'll go on to many articles I have, again, as much as time allows, on the Christian front. But first, I just want to remind you of last year's broadcast to update the news of this year and how quickly the year goes to melt into what we were sharing last year. That was broadcast number 618th, October the 10th, 1983. Cardinal Cook had just passed away, and the new cardinal who replaced him is Mr. O'Connor, the very conservative archbishop who is putting down Gerald Reed Ferraro and taking the Catholic votes away from Mondale and Ferraro by bringing the Catholic religion into this, which they didn't do when John Kennedy was running as president. They didn't bring that up at all, but now they are pushing for Reagan's election. He's very close to the Vatican, has an envoy at the Vatican, and they are continuously making this one of the decisions to turn the middle class, the Irish Catholic, the Boston Catholic, the New York, usually part of the Democratic Party, away from the Democrats to vote for Ronald Reagan. Cardinal Cook passed away last year. One of those attending his funeral was Senator Alphonse D'Amato. He's very close to Jerry Falwell, and it was close to Larry McDonald, and he was selling buttons for a nonprofit foundation, the Soviet Massacre Assistance Fund, out of Washington, D.C. I was talking about Tom Pappas, the Greek member of the military elite from Greece, with strong links to our CIA and to Spiro Agnew, which I published 10 years earlier, and it was just coming out. The exposés of the links were just coming out in the establishment media last year. Also, there was an article about John Belushi, the major drug scandal in Los Angeles that would result if there was a trial of Kathy Smith, and described it would be one of the messiest stories of the decades. But the Pankow story wasn't, and the John DeLorean story wasn't, and you see right now how adept they are at covering up stories that link to the very, very highest echelons of government. There was an article last week that Kathy Smith will probably be sent back to Los Angeles for trial, and then it mentions the allegations that she was an informer for the Los Angeles Police Department. Last year I talked about an article, The Military Prepares for the Day When Men in Space Control the Entire World. And that goes back to High Frontier, Daniel Graham, and the people working, again, close to Jerry Falwell and around Jerry Falwell, accepting the space war, the limited nuclear war, the elevation of people into space colonies, and also linking the military to the religious group, strong connections of Daniel Graham and his friends, and the high-up military to Jerry Falwell. Also, last year, the Hughes Tool Company merged on particular units with the W.R. Grace Company, and I believe that Hughes has been the umbrella for the Nazification of America was, and that Mr. J. Peter Grace, as much as any single person, with Otto Ambrose and Mr. Milliken on the board of the Grace Company that also set up Western Goals and their computers with the police, and a high-up official in charge of the Knights of Malta in this country. One is an organization run allegedly by the Mormon Mafia, or was, at least when they took control over Howard. The other is the Catholic Church, working very well together, merging in business and working with their beliefs in the Vatican and in Jesus Christ and in the Armageddon and all the traditional beliefs that the fundamentalists do also. They don't believe in the identical structure, but they work together on a political basis, and that's one of the important things. Then there also was an article and a pamphlet handed out last year called The Declaration of Support for the Nicaraguan Freedom Fighters. Those are members of Anastasia Somoza's army that were like the SAVAK in Iran or the DINA in Chile, the special elite police force that do the kind of torturing I shared with you last week. And members of this group who signed the Declaration of Support was Robert Morris, chairman of the National Committee to Restore International Internal Security. He was working with our committees in Washington for the internal security, and also set up the Young Americans for Freedom, who came to his home from Munich, Germany, and works with Gerard O'Neill in Princeton, the home of the space stations, the designing the livable part of them. Also, on this declaration of support for Nicaraguan freedom fighters is Lieutenant Daniel O'Graham and Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority in the John Birch Society, Lieutenant General C.M. Talbot, Chief of Staff of the Military Order of World Wars, who is also on that Coalition for Peace Through Strength with Falwell. And the same names you see are running through the freedom fighters, the Somoza Army, the Peace Through Strength, the Star Wars, the Biblical Prophecies, all working together and certainly pushing for Ronald Reagan's election so that they can be in business and get what they want out of the Congress and out of the candidates from now on. They'll be very much in control. Now, there was an article about Billy Graham when he went to the Soviet Union a couple of weeks ago in the L.A. Herald. It was by Rabbi Abraham Cooper from the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, and he was the title is called "The Soviet Worshippers That Billy Graham Won't See," and he's telling about the Jews that haven't published Bibles in Russia since 1917, since the revolution, and he is addressing himself to a Soviet Union that is so horrible, and he refers to the Afghanistan incident and the Korean airline tragedy, dealing with these people who are so low, and he refers to the new Cold War and Andrei Sakharov, who's languishing there in some prison. Now, this line, the Afghanistan invasion, the Korean airline, and the Sakharov are the only three issues that the far-right fundamentalists, now this isn't only the Christians, the Jews, keep hammering at. And yet this rabbi from the Wiesenthal Center is a part of a team who go along, not for whatever reason I don't know, to say that Martin Bormann is dead, when everyone knows they're alive. I got documents from the archives that would have gone to them, except that they don't want them because they don't want to know if he's alive. And this Cooper, Rabbi Cooper, is trying to tell you about how bad it is in the Soviet Union, while Martin Bormann is gaining strength and buying up corporations and merging Nazi gold now into every possible way to take over the world, and probably using a good hunk of that money to turn the world Christian. So he just mentioned Billy Graham, what he won't see, and threw in the Korean airline. So because I saw that, it reminded me of sections on the book on Billy Graham that I have, and I just want to share about 2 or 3 sentences from this book because they have to do with Ronald Reagan and some of the people we've been talking about and where Graham is coming from, or where he came from, in terms of the fundamentalist churches. Billy Graham, this is a biography of him, went to Bob Jones College. It was an evangelist that had a school in Cleveland, Tennessee, and his mother sent him there. He said, I didn't have the slightest idea what kind of school it was. All I knew it was Christian. It was more like evangelical boot camp. So Billy Graham, from there he went up to Wheaton, Illinois, to a Christian college, from Florida up to Wheaton, and if my memory serves me right, Ronald Reagan attended a Christian college in Wheaton for about 123 students, then gave his brother a scholarship there, helped him through college, and Billy Graham was up in Wheaton. A fellow who shared religious training with him, who knew him, came down from Canada, described him as not just about the closest thing to Jesus on earth. This friend described Billy Graham with his blonde hair and his appearance, that he's sort of like Christ's American son, this book, very modest, being the son of Christ. And then it goes on to tell that another close associate of his was John Conley, who pronounced him the conscience of America. Billy Graham is the conscience of America. Then in this book, I'm jumping over parts of it, it tells about the Youth for Christ campaigns, and this is where his career began, that they start an organization of Saturday night evangelical extravagandas. We use every modern means to catch the attention of the unconverted. We punch them right between the eyes with the gospel. We mounted out of a bare little office on Chicago's North Wells Street, run by Tory Johnson. These fundamentalist rallies were ostensibly addressed to the new generation that emerged during America's absorption in global struggle. When the war with Youth for Christ was a phenomena, he goes on to describe how they put on these shows and this movement was going on, and then they got the sponsorship of people such as William Randolph Hearst and a lot of newspapers, and that began his career. He systematically changed his delivery. This is Billy Graham. He followed Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson. He studied in the mirrors. He had poses that he took. He rehearsed his pulpit poses wherever he had a hand or a full-length mirror, and he lugged around a lot of books to pull out and quote at various times. And as he practiced this and carried on his circus, it was time to go to the international set. So by 1946, Hearst had followed him and provided him and Youth with Christ for a trip abroad. Now, Billy Graham came out of the South, the fundamentalist Christian. Randolph Hearst was a Catholic. He was pro-Adolf Hitler, Goering and Goebbels and Hitler. He had them writing for his papers, the Examiner, and his Eastern papers that he owned. And then he put his money not into a Catholic, but into the fundamentalist Christian who could go around traveling. And they put money into the Youth for Christ International. They were accompanied in their first excursion to Europe, not only by a Hearst reporter, but by a life photographer. And this is Henry Luce, a Knight of Malta, like Claire Luce was knighted by the Vatican also. But here are Hearst and Luce, two Catholics, sending the Youth for Christ with Billy Graham out on a trip with the cameras and the coverage, the newspapers, Lifetime, Fortune, and Hearst reported. They accompanied these Youth for Christ, and when they departed from the Chicago airport, Billy had his entourage, including his friend Mr. Templeton, kneel with him on the tarmac by the ramp of the plane for a brief prayer meeting, the photographers saying at every amen, keep praying, while they obligingly did, and the wind was flapping the ties in their faces. Doesn't this sound like the Pope posing and taking his trips all over Europe with the backdrop and the cameras blowing? Along this trip, it goes on, Mr. Luce and Mr. Hearst representatives were following Billy as he went up and down the aisles on the plane, and wherever he went, he was photogenic, and he was promoted by those people. Then the book goes on, industriously undertaking to verse himself in the new youth of the 60s. Billy Graham used to sometimes wear dark glasses and put on a mustache and disguise himself and go on the Sunset Strip or camouflage himself at student demonstrations to see what they were doing, the student radicals. And he came to the conclusion, as he's supposed to be objective when he goes to the meetings, you understand, after he's been pushed all over Europe from 1946 into the 60s and back, and with the Luce Empire and Hearst Empire, he comes to the conclusion that student radicals are very dangerous to the security of our nation. You see, the student radicals were anti-war, and the Bible says you have the war, and they're anti-Christ because they weren't attending church on Sunday. So he had to come down on the student radicals, and under the bare example of wearing dark glasses and a mustache and going there, he realizes that they are truly the danger to this nation. So he has to get to work, and then the book do something about it. And the book says it was a time in the life of the country in the 60s, after the assassination of John Kennedy, when it seemed that some cellar door had suddenly gone open, and berserkness and chaos came out. Remember Richard Nixon's Operation Chaos when he was working with Billy Graham. This chaos came out. The American regulars, like Ronald Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover, could not have been any more uncomprehending of the American mystics like Alan Graham, Norman Mailer, Lyndon Johnson than they could have understood Leroy Jones or Bob Dylan. Well, I think J. Edgar Hoover and Ronald Reagan understood Lyndon Johnson fairly well. I don't know where they get to the point that Lyndon Johnson, who was in the House of Representatives for years, was such a loony, and even the anti-war movement was against Lyndon Johnson. But he puts on his mustache and realizes, as he sees the crowd, what is happening. And he said, with those rifle cracks in Dallas, in fact, the old schizophrenic conflict in American psyche between the soldiers and discipline and the recurring struggle of the mystery of who we actually are emerged after John Kennedy was killed. Then this book goes on. I remember one evening at the Los Angeles Beverly Hilton Hotel, it was in Beverly Hills, where Governor Reagan was speaking, and there he came in, tall, boxy-shouldered, still staunchly handsome. This guy was going to run for president at the time. Graham thought he was ready to retire as the governor. And in the same party was the Los Angeles County Sheriff leading the Pledge of Allegiance, and they played the Star-Spangled Banner and made their pledge, and everyone settled down to their English Channel soul and wine sauce and listened to music from the Sound of Music, Manny Herman's music, and the theme of Zhivago. And at that moment, this is in the Billy Graham book, at that moment, in the dark hills of Big Sur, this is in California, some 300 miles to the north, where a rock festival is about to begin, another host is gathering as the last ghosts of the days dim away to the rim of the sea. A numberless convocation of spectral youths with long filmy hair coming out of everywhere, out of the mountains, out of the night. At the Beverly Hilton, Reagan takes the lectern and talks in a voice and talks to these people, of course, about the founding fathers. If we've all been lumped together in what they call the establishment, then we better work together, Reagan said, because there are those abroad and in our land working night and day who will alienate our young people. Countlessly they continue to come filtering out of the mountains as if by some uneven horn of the evening, looking like Che Guevara or Bowery derelicts in the attire of Pawnees, and the author jumps from the Hilton Hotel to Big Sur with the knapsacks, the guitars, the unlit lanterns, and the party of the 70s that Ronald Reagan then describes. He said, "Let us not confuse what is going on. We will lead the way to a renewed commitment to integrity and morality. Our forefathers wove God into the very fabric of government. We must do no less." And the crowd rose to their feet in the hurrahs. Now, this was Ronald Reagan in the 60s. This isn't Ronald Reagan 1984. God was going to save us. These plans of doing the things that they're doing were laid out at the end of World War II. The evangelicals started to be funded in the 50s. They could have an excuse because of the turmoil after Kennedy was killed. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and there's so much rest in this nation. But the reason I share that part from Billy Graham is that he and Ronald Reagan and Sheriff Peter Pitches and J. Edgar Hoover were all working together continuously, and this isn't a new point breaking over from an old tradition. Reagan waited till he had his 4 years in, and when he's sure he would be president for the next 4, then he could run with the Christian fundamentalists that he went to college with, and psychologically and in every other way he's been with all along. Now, the Washington Post had a story recently, the greatest story ever told. This is August the 18th, 1984, just a week before the Republican convention is to begin. This is not just an ordinary book. It's called The Book. You may be seeing it in your stores if you haven't seen it yet. What the book is a rewriting of the Bible. They've spent $5 million on publicity to make sure you want it. $5 million. And it's published by Tyndale House, Tyndale, of Wheaton, Illinois. Again, where Billy Graham went for his Christian fundamentalist work, where Ronald Reagan came from. Wheaton, Illinois, and I think Bob Woodward, who wrote The Lies about John Belushi from Wheaton, Illinois, and a few other illustrious people. Now, there's a $5 million blitz on this particular book. I saw one on the stand the other day, and it's not the Bible per se. They're making it readable so that you understand it. Now, the endeavor for this was put up by Christian Broadcasting Network of Virginia Beach. CBN, who got the idea, when you open the book, we tell you right off it is the Bible. CBN, it was run by Pat Robertson, the founder of the nonprofit network, in 1960. Now, 1960 is when the Young Americans for Freedom, working with General Walker in Munich, Germany, it was formed, Young Americans for Freedom was formed in 1960, that same year, with William Buckley and Robert Morris and Ronald Reagan. In 1962 is when the men came from Munich to see Robert Morris. But 1960 was the year that YAF, with William Buckley and Douglas Caddy, formed Young Americans for Freedom. That's the year that Pat Robertson began his 700 Club in 1960. He was a former roommate at Yale with J. Peter Grace, and William Buckley got his career started from Yale also. And of course, Ronald Reagan's wife, Nancy, was roommate at Smith College with the sister of William Buckley, which she doesn't discuss very much. You wouldn't know that Nancy went to Smith College, but she was a student there. Pat Robertson, close links, again, always going back here with J. Peter Grace, the Otto Ambrose. I look at the Nazi connections, the German connections, and their links to the various organizations that I keep referring to on this program and repeat the names on purpose, because here comes Pat Robertson with 1960, the money to start the 700 Club on television, and in 1984, or starting in 1982, $5 million are going into the book. Now, the book is going to be sold at all the various markets and book sales around the copy. CBN, that's a Christian Broadcasting Network, is pushing the Bible. They're pushing it harder. Read the Bible, read the Bible, read the book. The idea was conceived by Dr. Kenneth Taylor, founder and chairman of Tyndale House. It's called The Living Bible, as a paraphrase for the Bible. Basically, he wrote a book called The Living Bible, and now the word is to paraphrase, as I say, what is in the Bible so that you understand it. For example, they give examples of how when in the St. James Version, if it gives one translation, they make it readable for you and change the wording. King James says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The book will say, "Your words are a flashlight to light up the path ahead of me and keep me from stumbling." That's a translation. The book reads, they have the book, and the King James says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was out form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." The book says, "When God began creating the heavens and earth, the earth was shapeless, a chaotic mass, and the Spirit of God was broadening over the dark vapors." Isn't that a horrible thing to take that and rearrange it? Now, the Christian Broadcasting, as I say, has put $5 million. They hired Compton Advertising Company of Madison Avenue. Read the book, read the book. They have 5 television commercials that they had last September in between some important programs. They're going to use spots through the Academy Awards. They're advertising for the book. You'll see it advertised. And they've selected certain cities around the country to begin. They'll have it at B. Dalton, Walden Books, Safeway, Osco Drugs, Kmart, television commercials, and interrupting various shows. And they expect millions and millions of the book to be sold. The Bible will be translated for the morons so that they can get the story and get the message easy. Then you don't have a chance to misunderstand when they interpret it for you. Now, very close to this whole scene of the people behind all of this, the Falwells and the Christian right and Ronald Reagan, are people such as Paul Laxalt, as I say, who's on the Coalition for Peace Through Strength. Paul Laxalt just sent out letters to ministers, telling them to vote for Ronald Reagan, and really paraphrasing it, that this is their duty. There's an article called "God and Politics" in the Washington Post. It goes like this: "The most alarming effort to Christianize America was a week before the GOP convention in Dallas, when Senator Paul Laxalt, chairman of the Reagan-Bush Committee, addressed his letter to Christian ministers and priests. He sent this letter to 45,000 fundamentalist pastors. You may have read it or you may not. Dear Christian leader, as leader under God's authority, we can't afford to resign ourselves to idle neutrality in this election that will confirm or silence the president who has worked so diligently on your behalf and behalf of all Americans, for these Christian fundamentalist pastors. Ronald Reagan shares an unwavering commitment to the traditional values that you share. Now, you organize a voter registration drive in your church to assure that those in your ministry have a voice in the upcoming election, a voice that will surely help secure the re-election of President Reagan and Vice President Bush. Along with these letters was a flyer Christian Voter Program information enclosed, and there's a picture of Ronald Reagan. It says he's been faithful in his support of your issues and for Christian citizens. The message was to Christians, informing them that they should be sure and register in their churches, the people who are not registered, that the church is dependent upon good policies in Washington with the right president. That's really what he's saying. And that's Paul Laxalt. Now, Laxalt is an interesting person for several reasons. Number one, he's been mentioned as the closest friend of Robert Keith Gray, who I keep saying I want to do more on this broadcast, the public relations gentleman who really is the off-campus part of the Central Intelligence Agency who can do and get things done through corporations that Casey can't get done by himself. Paul Laxalt, William Casey, the same Casey I mentioned last week with the torturing, the CIA tortures of tearing the flesh off and burning people alive. Laxalt and Casey and Robert Keith Gray are very close in ways I want to detail one more time for you. But the Howard Hughes organization had long ago selected first Richard Nixon through the Lincoln Club in 1946 to be President of the United States, along with the arms race and bringing Nazis to the country. Next was to be Ronald Reagan with his fundamentalist Christian background and his contacts through General Electric Theater and Hollywood to carry the election process in Congress, and the next selected president to the Hughes, what they call the Hughes organization, was to be Paul Laxalt. This has been documented in various papers that belong to the Summa Corporation and in their hands. Now, there's a new book coming out, and there'll be parts of it in Playboy November and December, on the life of Howard Hughes, briefly described in the newspaper last week, the San Jose Mercury. Hughes' bid for power. Author says the recluse paid off politicians in an effort to buy control of the White House. Now, if no Howard Hughes was seen since 1966, who was buying the White House and the Paul Laxalt? Because the Hughes organization moves into Nevada, where Laxalt is the governor and now the senator. And this is almost like the missing Bormann and Eva Braun and Hitler's story, the missing Howard Hughes and the takeover of it's a mystery of bodies. I think I've solved both of them, and I don't want to make it too confusing for you. In one, they said they were all dead and they were alive. In this case, they took the man, and then when he was died, they had Vance Cooper in his place. But this author claims, he wrote for Wall Street Journal and Washington Post, and I don't trust those sources too much, but he has a lot of documents, and he says that the recluse paid off the politicians. The Hughes organization, of course, did. And describing just a article on the book, it's on Citizen Hughes, published by Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston. Michael Drosnin says, it talks about Richard Nixon and the Democratic Party and how problems of Watergate stemmed from Larry O'Brien from the Democratic Party working for Howard Hughes, and we have similar situation of the Democrats taking over, so-called Democrats taking over the Democratic Party, who actually are linked to the Hughes organization, to the CIA, and now continue on with Robert Keith Gray, such as Frank Mankiewicz, and a lot of top Democrats in his office that really work with the intelligence community, and the Democratic Party will never, ever rise up out of this, I don't think, again. Now, just a couple of things about this article in Paul Laxalt. To mention it, they called members of the Summa Corporation to say, is it true that Howard tried to control the political parties? And a person quoted by the name of Harry Lieber said, he can't imagine why a recluse was trying to buy his way into the White House. Well, Howard, first of all, if Howard wasn't seen or visible, it was his controllers that were buying their way into the White House. It has nothing to do with Howard. There was no Howard. In Nevada, when that body moved in that train in the dark of night, Paul Laxalt never saw any Howard Hughes. Chester Davis, the attorney for the Hughes Corporation, never saw Howard Hughes. Robert Mayhew never saw Hughes. Laxalt, Mayhew, and Davis, or any of the top people in Nevada from 1966 on, never saw him after John Rosselli and Mayhew delivered to him a hospital in Boston for brain surgery. Howard was never, because Paul Laxalt is the recipient or heir of possibility of becoming the President of the United States, and because he is lining up with contacting 45,000 fundamentalist Christians associated with Jerry Falwell in the limited nuclear war in the Defense Department, we have to take another look at Falwell and Laxalt and William Casey with his murderous teams in Central America. I'll do some of that and some more articles on the Christian fundamentalists. We'll take a 1-minute break, and side 2 continue with articles of Falwell and the Christians and what they're doing and saying at the present time. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 670, October the 8th, 1984, side 2 of this tape. And now that we have the background of Falwell and some of his complicated contacts with generals and admirals and the Defense Department and the fundraiser for the President of the United States, Mr. Paul Laxalt, these complex personalities, I want to go into some of the articles about the Christian fundamentalists that have been in the news in the past few weeks since they were so apparent and so accepted by the President at the Republican Convention. One is from the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, titled, "With Backing of $6.5 million and More on the Way, Falwell Says He Can't Lose." And this comes from Dallas, in quotes, "We found we didn't have to do any compromising last week. We had sheer numbers to win. The moral majority has 6.5 active members, including 2 million Catholics, a significant number of Jews." Falwell, the article goes on to say, helped to organize a group of 100,000 conservative Christian ministers that are based in San Diego. 100,000. Now, remember, here is Senator Paul Laxalt addressing a letter to 45,000 fundamentalist pastors. The group is called the American Coalition for Traditional Value. The group, and they are run by a fellow who wants a Christian United States, Gary Jarman, who said he wants a Christian GOP. The group will give Falwell direct access to the nation's 50 million fundamentalist and evangelical Christians. Did this grow on you? Were we all sleeping when this was happening? That they undressed this thing in Dallas, and now the figures are coming out. 50 million fundamentalist evangelical Christians. The article says Falwell's efforts are now becoming broad. He's becoming multi-denominational, joining with the Catholics and the fundamentalists. And this is in many articles, the union of the Vatican and the 50 million fundamentalists. They will press politicians of both parties to adopt the conservative agenda. Falwell, the American Coalition, will use their pulpits and register over 2 million conservative voters before November the 6th, and they hope to influence this country for at least the next 3 decades, the article says. Falwell believes the Republican Party has found the formula that assures political success. It brings them together: free enterprise, people committed to a strong national defense, and religious Americans. That is the formula. He is a fundamentalist, and there's a description in this one article on fundamentalists. They believe that salvation is based on the literal interpretation of the Bible, and Falwell considers himself a fundamentalist. They're the evangelicals who believe in the message of the Scripture, but are generally tolerant of those when the Bible is subject to interpretation, which Falwell isn't, and the charismatics who speak in different unknown tongues involved in divine healing. Another article, a long story from the New York Times, political and religious shifts rekindle the church and state issue. And it quotes Jerry Falwell, starting out in 1965. He began in 1965, and Pat Robertson began in 1960. Falwell started his church when people were marching and registering in Selma, Alabama, having the blacks go to school and equal housing, and Reverend Falwell said that ministers should not be involved in marches. They should not do anything like that. Even if they're fighting communism or participating in civil rights, they shouldn't leave their pulpit. That was 1965. Now, in 1984, he's practically running the White House and writing the GOP platform. Can you believe, from 1965 to 1984, in that time period, where did those years go? These 20 years, and he is writing the platform for the Republican Party that used to be somewhat brighter or intellectual, not too bright, but we thought were the Wall Street people, representing the interests of Wall Street. No, the fundamentalists, well, he represents Wall Street, but this frame of mind was so foreign to people. Years ago, we thought of them as a freak group, a fringe group, just on the edge of somewhere of no importance. Reverend Falwell, when he started out, built up momentum until the late 70s. That's when Richard Nixon was really in power, from 1968 to the 70s, with his Operation Chaos, his COINTEL program, the MK Ultra, the mind control, because John Kennedy was dead, Robert Kennedy was dead, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evans, and a whole gang of them, Whitney Young, Adlai Stevenson, were all out of the way. And now, enter the political arena, and the fundamentalists began to organize around their issues. This is the New York Times. Abortion, homosexuality, equal rights amendment, busing for racial integration, teaching in schools, the Bible, and so forth, and a stronger military. That's what they emerged as wanting, not the things like to make this country or any other country better, whether it's in Central, South America, Asia, Africa, or whatever. Nothing really to do with education, the poor, low-cost housing, health plans, equal job opportunities. This is basically white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, sexist, racist, against third world, for military juntas, for dictatorships. And in the 1980s, newly activated, they attached themselves to Ronald Reagan's presidential candidacy and were in the decision-making of the GOP platform. That's from the New York Times. The president not only embraced their views, but he embraces the group themselves. This just came out, as I say, this September the 2nd, New York Times. Another long article, Politics in the Pulpit Stirs the Old Debate. This is Los Angeles Times, September the 5th. I'm just going to give you highlights of these stories. Jerry Falwell declared September the 23rd Voter Awareness Day. Preachers of the gospel will use political activism. The fundamentalist churches in 50 states will be active. And they quote Gary Jarman, the fundamentalist who has the organization called Christian Voice, who's the lobbyist for Ronald Reagan with the Christian people. And this is what Jarman says. I heard him on television. He's scary. And this is a quote from the newspaper, LA Times. Someone's morality is going to be imposed on in society. It's a war between those who have a basically humanist view of morality and those who have my view. That's why I, last week ago, had at length the Jack Anderson story of the torture that our CIA and John Singlau, who belongs to the Coalition for Peace Through Strength with Jerry Falwell as co-chairman, head of the World Anti-Communist League, believe in. They are pushing their view basically against a humanist view. Those who have a basically humanist view of morality, or they have my view, says Mr. Jarman, and my view is a Christian America, and this is a war, he says. And someone's morality is going to be imposed on society, and it will be mine. This is the LA Times. This goes on to say the Republican National Committee was going to give this group $200,000 to encourage voters to register, but they have so much money they turned it down. And the polls of the University of Chicago National Opinion Research say that the fundamentalist Christians are the largest growing group in America, particularly among the young people. And they're starting them out. It's showing off the 20 years of early preschool training and early informative year training in high school and Christian colleges, and the young people starting with the Bible when they're little and this training from the preschool. As they get to the colleges, the Christian Jesus freak and the Bible caring people are becoming a large number of the youth today who stick together with that kind of training. This starting article in the LA Times says there's such a thing as being born again, and there's a second coming. Ronald Reagan was the second coming. The president has been immeasurably aided by political activism of the religious crusaders, the anti-abortion Catholics, the evangelical Christian ministers like Jerry Falwell, and the Southern Baptist leaders such as Reverend Charles Stanley from Atlanta, Georgia, the First Baptist Church. There are 14 million Southern Baptists. Theologically conservative, it is a movement that is politically active, and there are a good number, 2,000 cells for the National Right to Life Federation, and Mr. Jarman takes credit for getting 1,500 of the 5,000 delegates from the convention, the GOP convention, through his organization. The Houston Chronicle, September the 9th, has a story in big black letters with Reagan making a face. Reagan lashes out at the anti-religionists. The irate Reagan lashes out at the anti-religionists. An irate president says the anti-religionists are breaking down the walls of separation between church and state. He turns everything around, of course. Reagan's Dallas convention brought out the point that politics and religion are necessarily related, according to Reagan, and that his close association with the fundamentalist Christian groups and his support for a constitutional amendment allowing prayer breakfast in school has raised again the question of separation of church and state. And as I said before, on the other side, when you push the constitutional amendment for praying in school, and when it pushes the constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, then you get Henry Kissinger, and this article mentions the Constitutional Convention for Prayer in School, and other articles, the budget. Another story from the New York Times, GOP activism emerges on the screen. And it goes on, the approval Mr. Reagan gave yesterday to the powerful forces of Christian conservatism is understanding, as was the selection of Jerry Falwell, the most prominent evangelist, to give the benediction for the prayer breakfast in Dallas. Reagan's support of these religious activists is expressed and is expected to have an effect beyond Reagan's own tenure. Falwell made a veiled threat yesterday against Vice President George Bush as being a moderate. He asked in his prayers, "Our Heavenly Father, for this Vice President, we especially ask thy hand be upon him," or else, I suppose. Then New York Times had still another story. I'm not taking these according to papers, but of interest that I be sure to get as many as I can on the tapes as we cover this material. August the 24th, Evangelist used computer exchange. This is a man, John Marrier, M-A-R-R-I-E-R, who lives in San Jose, California. He's a computer salesman, a consultant and programmer, and a Christian fundamentalist. And he thinks there's an untapped market of lonely people working their computers, and he wants to spread the gospel by way of computers because the computer buffs are intellectuals who have better intelligence than most people, more money than most people, and more possibility to learn the gospel through the computer when there's a spare moment. So he has an idea to tap these lost souls. So he started a group in 1982 called Computers for Christ, and he has an electronic bulletin board that runs through home computers, and he gets 180 telephone calls daily about Christ. He gets 30 subscribers a day. Now he's got branches in Riverside, California, in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Columbia, Maryland, in Lakeland, Florida, and in Saipan in Hong Kong. And this article goes on to say, it's from the New York Times, the whole ministry of Computers for Christ is designed to minister the gospel of Jesus Christ to the cult of the intellectual, above average. Now, the background of Mr. Marrier was he studied psychology at West Texas University, then went to San Jose, and he studied criminology at the University of Texas. Now, the University of Texas is where Bobby Inman is setting up his massive computers with 6 or 8 of the largest computer companies in the world, maybe 10. And I'm wondering if they will pipe into the Computers for Christ in the Evangelical Computer Organization. You see, Bobby Inman was National Security Advisor, and he was also Deputy Director of the CIA under George Bush, the same George Bush that was in the White House with William Clark and Edwin Meese when Falwell had his 300 Baptist, and not only Baptist, the fundamentalist ministers before the convention. Bobby Inman worked for George Bush at the time that Henry Kissinger was their boss. Also, Kissinger in charge of Robert Keith Gray and Edwin Wilson, all working for the CIA, and Bobby Inman goes on now to Texas. This fellow, just 2 years ago, began, I don't think Inman was in Texas 2 years ago, but I'm sure there were computers beginning there, and leaves there to set up Computers for Christ, and already is located. If they give you 5 or 6 locations, there may be more that we don't know about. Now, Jack Anderson has been running a series again about the Justice Department and Reagan's appointee, Mr. Regnery, Alfred Regnery, as the director of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. This is a good one for a Christian fundamentalist. Mr. Regnery is close to Falwell and that group, and they want to show that early education, I guess the preschool Christian, is a good influence and get the pornographers and the Antichrist off the street. And this article is pointing out again Mr. Regnery's wanting to take children from 9 to 12 years of age, and on the basis of their being left or right-handed, or the shape of their toes or their earlobes, or the way they sweat to electric shock, to predict their behavior. And recently he was given a huge sum, $500,000 or $600,000, to do a study on the effect of pornography, of Hustler and Playboy and West and Penthouse on children, juveniles, as if they sit and watch it. Anyway, you can't buy those at the places children can reach, and parents don't have to leave them around. But Falwell and Mr. Regnery and Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese are working close on these projects together. And of course, Regnery has direct links to the university in Washington that Mrs. Meese is on the board, and they're all working close to get rid of the pornographers. But in fighting them, to get Christ, the idea that Christ is ever present, and they almost need the pornographers in order to have a speech to talk about. When the anti-war movement came, they had to infiltrate it with a lot of the CIA and Defense Department anti-war protesters in order to have speeches about the anti-war people. Now, this problem of sex and juveniles and Mr. Regnery makes me believe that the stories of children being molested in nursery schools is being built up. Not that it doesn't exist, it in fact does exist, but a good hunk of it has been delayed in being investigated and now is being promoted in election years, and will put in the minds of people also as the investigations go on that these children should be in those Christian schools. See, Mr. Falwell and Mr. Regnery don't like Larry Flynt writing articles about Larry McDonald and why he was killed by the intelligence of the White House because of his participation in Western Goals and with the Los Angeles Police Department. The investigation, the huge mass of money to find out the links of these magazines came after Larry Flynt began exposing Edwin Meese, their friend Edwin Meese, and Larry McDonald for the kinds of things that they were involved in and were being investigated for when McDonald's plane went down. The Los Angeles Times had an ad this last September for a program, Sunday, September 23rd, at on the pulpit of Dr. Robert Schuller, another well-known Sunday, almost prime-time minister at the Crystal Cathedral. And on the 23rd, they were saying that next Sunday, September 30th, to speak with Dr. Robert Schuller is Peter Grace, chairman of the board of W.R. Grace and Company. Again, the links to Mr. Ambrose, to Zyklon B, to I.G. Farben, to Western Goals, the LAPD, the international, really, the crooks and criminals, go from church to church, working with these ministers of the television, J. Peter Grace, to be the guest of Dr. Robert Schuller. He isn't as far right or bad as the others, but they take up a lot of the television time and are pushing, this whole program that the world should be Christian. It goes along with it. Now, there's another story covering these events. I'll rush through some of these quickly. Maybe you saw them, maybe you didn't. San Francisco Chronicle, school prayer foes called intolerant, big black letters. Ronald Reagan says the state needs the church. And he gave a speech that the state has to get along. It can't function without the church. The church is what makes the state strong. The state needs the church. He says, we are the party of the future. They are the party of the past. We are the party of new ideas. They are the party of tired old cliches. The Republican Party is the one where the government needs the church, and in order to keep her out of school is terrible. It's intolerant. We shouldn't do it. Another New York Times story, TV evangelists assume a larger convention role. This refers to Dr. M.G. Pat Robertson, who was very pleased with Dallas. He runs a Christian broadcasting network. That's the fellow that I said was helping put $5 million to get the book out, the publicity to get it out. And he says TV is shaping the audience, and it gives the leading conservative preachers the power they wield, and all during the Republican convention it was evident that the TV evangelists were now assuming a greater political role. They went from the home television on Sundays or early mornings, weekday mornings, on to making the GOP platform. And it refers to Reverend Jerry Falwell, the Reverend James Robison, who from Dallas, who gave the opening prayer of the Republican convention, Reverend Jimmy Swaggart, Reverend Dr. Greg Dixon of Indianapolis Baptist Temple, the Coalition for Religious Freedom, and Phyllis Schlafly was there, and Pat Robertson is mentioned several times in this article as being important for Jerry Falwell and his platform and for guiding the Republican Party from now on. There was one story in the LA Times, rigid platform may be trying to force Reagan farther right than he can go. I think Reagan can go as far as he wants, and this article says that during Reagan's term, he promised to balance the budget. Now he has this big deficit, and the 1984 platform wants this constitutional convention on the budget that I mentioned, but that again goes along with the abortion. It's not going any farther right than Reagan wanted, and he knew he'd get the votes, and no matter what happens between now and November, he will surely get the votes. Another article about Dr. Reverend Hill from Los Angeles, the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church, his prayers for Ronald Reagan. This was in the Wall Street Journal, and also in the Washington Post they carried this story, and how at the convention Jerry Falwell spoke to the President and Vice President Bush, and he said they were his instruments in rebuilding America, and Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, gave God's message and gave them a good send-off. All the top ministers and so forth are giving them a send-off. Another story in the Daily World tells at the Republican convention that as they came in, there's a huge color photo of Reagan and Nancy and the Pope on display in the lobby, and Jerry Falwell and the right-wing preachers were there too, and a letter from the Pope, a word under the picture said, "We deeply value your counsel and support and express our solidarity with you." This came from the Pope when they met in Fairbanks, Alaska. The Christian right is very much in the news. If you look at it and read it and hear what they're saying, you'll pick up some of what I'm sharing with you now, or maybe you have already. As I said, last week I listened to some of the Christian radio out here, and one of the first things I heard from the Christian Research Institute in San Juan Capistrano was the quotation of Helen Marie Taylor, that friend of Phyllis Schlafly's, who was appointed to the Council on Humanities, that she says Bible should be literature, Bible should be read in the public schools. They should do it like they do Shakespeare. That's not religion in school. That's literature. And Helen Marie Taylor, Reagan's new appointee, long on Western goals with the military and the Nazis and the CIA and the generals and Admiral Moore and the whole gang, she was quoted in this Bible group. Christian Radio, KKMC, I listened to Reverend J. Vernon McGee, the Bible study just this week, and they're talking about the world, that there shouldn't be just one religion such as Catholic or Protestant, that the fundamentalists could coexist with the Vatican. But the important thing, the preacher went out, this Mr. McGee says, that now is the time of the Gentiles. It will soon be entirely the Gentiles. The tribulation is coming, the grand tribulation, and there he was on it, those 7 years. And he cites Luke 21 to 24 will be the time of the Gentiles, the fall of David, the Jew. The line of David has failed. God passed the scepter from him. He passed it to the hands of the Gentile. And the theme of the Lord is the second coming of Christ. And predicted in Adam and Eve, the story of Adam. Christ is coming. Look to him in the Revelations. The Roman Empire will come back. And then he refers to the blending together of East and West Germany. Evidently, he didn't realize that current visit has been called off. He'd made the tape ahead. He says Jerusalem will be knocked down, and Israel is important to Bible prophecy. That's what that paper that I shared with you before on Falwell and Israel, that's why I brought that up, is that that's what they're talking about. When I turn on my Christian broadcasting now, I hear it on the radio that Israel is important to the prophecy. This is what I took right off the air. In fact, I was taking notes. I keep a clipboard in the seat of the car with a pen. I usually take notes when I'm driving to L.A. if it's not very safe, but I look behind me sometimes in the rear view. And when this Bible show started on, I was writing like, man, I had to pull off the side of the road because I didn't want to miss what he was saying. And then I typed up when I got home, and he said it's the pre-millennium. There's only one place for Israel to exist. This is what this Reverend McGee was saying, and that's right now. That's their time and their place. That God promised Jews their own homeland. That was his promise. These are real promises. And then the revelation comes, and there's peace. That's for Israel. And then with tribulation, Israel has to be gone. You have to wipe out Israel. That's part of the Bible. If you're an Antichrist, if you're not a Christian, it's out. And then Bob Larson, another fellow on Christian radio, took over the next hour. And he's an expert on rock music, and he was telling them about Christians who burn their shirts from the Rolling Stones, which is okay, and how Prince is bisexual and so disgusting, and you shouldn't listen to his albums, you shouldn't even consider them, or else you're part of the Antichrist. And they got into music, and it's different than the rock music. I almost agree with them on some of this junk music that's coming out. But they were doing it from a Christian point of view that good Christians won't listen. And of course, the interesting thing is in the 60s, in the late 60s, and this was quite a while back, the musicians that gathered at Big Sur while Ronald Reagan was speaking at the Beverly Hilton Hotel were already singled out, those people, by Billy Graham and the Christian fundamentalists as being a threat to what they had to say and what they had to sell. Now, everything that I'm talking about has been unleashed out of this bottle that began in Dallas, Texas. 20 years after the murder of John Kennedy, Reagan wanted the convention in Dallas. And, of course, the day after the prayer breakfast, the Washington Times, the Reverend Moon paper, had an article, President Links Politics and Religion, and he wasn't afraid because he knows he'll have this next election to begin to speak. And this is what the president said. He said, politics and morality are inseparable. Religion and politics are necessarily related. We poison our society when we remove its theological underpinnings. We need religion as a guide. Our government needs the church. Many of you, I'm sure, heard the speech. There's a divine order that transcends the human order, the bedrock of the state. The moral order is religion. It logically follows that religion needs defenders against those who care only for the interest of the state. Now, he's talking about the interest of the states, to preserve the states, and who is he talking about? The state is nothing more than a reflection, Reagan said, of its citizens. The more decent the citizen, the more decent the state. Well, let's see if we're decent. Let's see when, before the hippies came and the anti-war movement, how decent we are. Sir Eric Gary, who ran the goon squads, the Mongoose team down in Grenada, the terror squad, he was instrumental in getting Maurice Bishop murdered again with our CIA, and the Washington officials in the Carter administration set him up in this place, and Ronald Reagan invaded. The murder of Maurice Bishop, Sir Eric Gary's back in Grenada. In the Philippines, we see the riots, the chaos there, the dictatorship supporting him, the murder of Benigno Aquino so Marcos can be there. In Vietnam, it was Premier Key, who's Hitler is his hero, and then Mr. Diem, and of course chaos and millions of lives left, and people living horrible lives because of what we did in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. We put in the Pahlavi Foundation, this decent state of ours, the Shah of Iran, the Nazi Pahlavis, had Mossadegh murdered, put in Zion, Pakistan, and got rid of Mr. Bhutto, all of these cases where the democracies were in Guatemala, got rid of Mr. Arbenz, put the CIA directing the dictatorship in Guatemala, in the Belgian Congo, murdering Patrice Lumumba, and putting in exploitation and murder, not making it a decent state. In the United States, the killing of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and hundreds of others. In El Salvador, the death squads that are torturing and brutalizing these people, as they are in Chile, getting rid of Allende, a democracy, an elected democracy, and putting in Pinochet in Nicaragua, putting in the Somoza family who controlled all of that, and Papa Doc in Haiti. Those are just a few of the countries where people might have had a chance for a democracy to flourish. Our government, our CIA, our Defense Department, William Casey from the OSS, Alan Dulles, who's dead, and the people that inherited his dirty jobs from him. He lived too long anyway. Maurice Bishop, Benigno Aquino, Mossadegh, Bhutto, Arbenz, Lumumba, the Kennedys, the King, Salvador Allende. Ronald Reagan had the nerve in Dallas, where John Kennedy was murdered by the highest levels of our American intelligence and cover-up. He has the nerve to say the state is nothing more than a reflection of its citizens. Reagan said, the more decent the citizens, the more decent the state. You can reverse that and say the more rotten the citizens, the more rotten the state. There are very few people that did enough to try to expose what was going on. And those who did, many fell down by the wayside and lost heart and didn't continue the battle. The fundamentalists stayed together, but the people who wanted to expose some of the injustices along the way and the assassinations along the way and the trickery along the way splintered off, got lost, didn't stick together, and now these people have literally taken over. Well, the time is out now. I probably will do some more on this next week. I hope I can get caught up with the other news, but I want to touch bases with what's in mind with these people who's making Ronald Reagan know that their votes are the ones that assure him of the presidency, and he will be obligated to them forevermore. And he's showing that in his promises of the appointments on the court. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. In the meantime, take care, and I hope I don't get any more messages through the television like I did last week. I'll let you know if I do. Bye-bye.